All right, welcome everyone. We are back and better than ever. We're speaking right at the end of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix.
It was a really early morning race. I'm still recovering from being up in the middle of the night.
Right.
But I guess I'm gonna have to get used to that on this side of the world.
You are. In 2 weeks' time, you won't have to, but for the
That's
moment, yeah,
true.
we appreciate you sticking it out. So, we want to get into the race a little bit, right? But I just wanted to get sort of off the top, right? And these have been two lackluster races, right? In terms of what the general population expects, and I would say that this race was probably not even as close to being as exciting as the last one in Bahrain, although there were quite a few exciting nuggets that I know we'll get into. I think just on the whole, this felt like another. I don't feel like I saw Max the entire race. Like I probably think I saw him at the beginning and at the end. That was it. Like
Yeah,
maybe
right.
you did more. Yeah.
No. I mean, it was similar. I think it was probably a more exciting race than Bahrain. There was some stuff to watch, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it was hardly a high bar to clear, and as soon as Max led into the first corner, you kind of knew that the game was up. The only thing that was mildly interesting was that Leclerc led Perez over the first few through the first few corners, and we were expecting a pass, which came just a few laps later. But Amar, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Over the past week, we have had a couple of videos out now. One of them was asking whether Red Bull were ruining
Um,
F1, and we had a lot of comments about that. Um, and I think our conclusion at the end of that was, it's really up to the teams to come up with a better solution and to make some progress. And I just want to look, I just want to talk a little bit about the regulations as they stand at the moment, right? Because a lot of what people are talking about is that they think, or we think that the regulations have failed. Okay. But I think that if I was the FIA right now, I would be holding my head in my hands thinking, what else could we have possibly done? And you can break that desperation, that slightly gutted feeling into three parts, I think. And each of those three parts can be divided further into what the intended consequence of that was, and then what the unintended consequence was, which is what we see now playing out, right? So the first is the fact that in 2022 we went to a new set of technical regulations that prioritized ground effect over body aero, which is what we were using for the last sort of 40 years, really, prior to ground effects being um, at which point ground effects have been banned. So the idea here, the intention here was that cars were affected so much by overbody aero that when you were following the car in front, the turbulent air meant you lost a huge amount of downforce. It meant you couldn't follow, and it meant that overtaking was more difficult. Fine. So that to me sounds like a good thing to go back to. They researched it. They felt that this is how much downforce the cars would lose based on this new model. And it was much less than it was prior to the introduction of the 2022 rules. And we did see that going into 22 and 23. But the unintended consequence of that is that one guy on the grid had far more experience of this than everybody else. He'd done his dissertation on it and he knew what the pitfalls were. I think other people knew what the pitfalls were as well, but ignored them because they were chasing this magic downforce number that the wind tunnel and the CFD were telling them about. So it meant that Adrian Newey just stole a march. Okay, so number one, technical regulations. The second was the cost cap. So the sporting regulations have introduced the cost cap, right? So the cost cap, the intended consequence of that was that no longer could you just outspend everybody else into winning a championship, right? And if you looked at how the championships had been run sort of 20, 21, going back further than that, every single year, there was a linear relationship between how much a team spent and where they finished in the championship. It was really stark that Mercedes was spending sort of 400 million a year, and Red Bull was spending maybe 270, 280, and those two were always first and second in that order. So it made sense that if you were able to reduce that, then there would be a level playing field, and more teams further down the grid would be able to get involved in the fight at the front. That again, to me, makes sense. Okay, it's something that, it shouldn't be that money is the barrier to being able to be competitive in the sport. So that to me on a fundamental level makes sense. And it has allowed teams to be on a much healthier financial footing. We're no longer worried about the teams at the back going out of business every season. But the unintended consequence of that is two things. The first is that teams now don't have the facility to be able to make big upgrades in the middle of a season. So last year, Ferrari and Mercedes both wanted to change their architecture to be able to bring themselves closer to Red Bull. They've had to wait till the end of the season to be able to do that, and have had to fight through last season, not learning anything with their new architecture because they didn't have the money, the budget within that cost cap to be able to introduce it. So it puts them further behind, and they're now doing the learning that they would have done 6 months ago, now at the beginning of a season. So they're even further behind. That's unintended consequence number one. Unintended consequence number two is that you now have teams like Haas, and we keep coming back to this, that are now, because of their financial security, feel like they don't have to be competitive to survive. They can carry on just raking in the money. They don't have to have a mega budget because everyone's got the same budget. And they therefore don't have to charge their sponsors as much or put in the same amount of money themselves to stay on the grid because they're protected. So you can run around at the back of the grid and not really do very much. The third is the thing that really should have helped out. This goes alongside the technical rules, and it's the first time that Formula One have used a balance of power or a balance of performance. And it's really subtle. It's not like they've said that you can only have a certain amount of engine power or you can only have a certain number of upgrades in a season. All they've said is that if you do well in a season, then you're limited in the amount of wind tunnel time and CFD time that you're allowed to use. And that's graded across the grid. So if you are first, you have, I think, something like 50% less wind tunnel time than if you finish last. But the problem that's happened there is because Adrian Newey has already stolen such a big march, everybody else has spent a lot of their extra wind tunnel time chasing things that are irrelevant. So they've gone down a rabbit hole and just continued down that rabbit hole and done more and more and more of it because they've got more wind tunnel time to do it. And it's meant that actually that's not brought anyone closer. In fact, in a team like Mercedes, it's probably taken them even further away. So there you go. Those are the three things. But those are the three things why all of the FIA's ideas were logical and should have brought tangible benefits, but they have unintended consequences that we are now seeing played out. And that's why I think we're seeing Red Bull so far ahead of everybody else. It's a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, it is a long answer, but I think I'm glad you brought this up because when we put out that video about F1 being being ruined effectively by the fact that Red Bull is so far out there, I think we got a lot of let's just say a lot of unpleasant comments, right? And a lot of frustrations. And I think this is the problem with trying to micromanage this, right? To a certain extent, which what you just said, which is there are unintended consequences for everything. So, right, even the last time you and I spoke, I suggested maybe bringing sort of a sliding scale to the cost cap, right? And that might be one of those things that could be looked at. I certainly did suggest it as an item to sort of look at, not necessarily change it. But I think that this is the problem with making so many tweaks. And as we've talked about before, these are overwhelming regulations. These are changing the landscape of the sport. So you cannot judge the efficacy of these regulations and the outcomes of it based on 2-3 seasons. Oh, by the way, you came off of the COVID years too, right? Which had a great impact. The sport was pretty much in trouble too. So there are so many different variables in this that you do have to wait it out. You have to see about, at
100%.
least in my opinion, at least half a decade, maybe even
Yeah,
more, to kind of see
100%
how this
agree.
happens. So
Yeah,
I couldn't agree with you more. What I would have wished would have happened is maybe all these three didn't go together at the same time, right? Especially the cost cap and the actual technical regulations, right? And maybe that would have given Ferrari and Mercedes a chance to catch up. But maybe not. I mean, look, as you stated, Mercedes went in a completely different direction, right? So they actually, I'm not even sure that if giving them more money would have solved the problem, or giving them the ability to spend more money. We don't know that. Even Ferrari, to a great extent, right? 2022 was kind of misleading in some ways until Fred Vasseur got there, and then last year they started this rebuild. And the reality of that also is that even with the time that they spent, you can see coming back to this race that Leclerc was 19 seconds behind Verstappen, and that's probably also
it's unreal.
slightly favorable to Leclerc, because he got a toe on that last on that last lap that he said the
And there was
fastest,
a safety car.
and there was a safety car. So that, yeah, so there you go. And there was a safety car in between. So I mean, what could that have been? I think one could guess it could easily have been half a minute, maybe not, maybe
Yeah,
even more possibly.
yeah,
And
I
and
agree.
this is the problem now. And you're right. So to go back to your initial point, right? I don't think the FI did anything wrong, because again, if you take now not just Verstappen but also Checo, and we should talk about Checo here in a second too, if you take the Red Bull cars out, the field is so tight, which is exactly the point of those regulations, is to bring everyone in together. I mean, Ollie Bearman missed Q3 just by a few, I don't know, what was it, a thousands of seconds, I don't know, maybe even less than that, right? He just missed out on that. So that goes to show that there are at least 5 or 6 teams in the mix, which is really the best outcome you could hope for. No one could have seen that Red Bull would go so far out there. Or maybe they should have known that, given that Adrian knew he
Yeah.
was on Red Bull. So there was a chance that whoever was going to have his services rather would sort of go there. So yeah, I don't see why, I don't think that too much tinkering helps, particularly at this stage. And we've got a few, milestones coming up in terms of what 26 represents, and then
Yeah.
28 as well. So
Yeah, I think
nothing
I
on
agree.
that.
There will be sort of potential natural resets. Should we talk about the race? Should we just
We
talk about
should. Let's talk about the race. Yeah.
about some stuff that
Let's
happened? So I'm going to do this in a very broad way, Omar. Were there any highlights for you? Anything that was interesting?
Well, as the resident Ferrari fan, I was really, really happy. Well, I should back up here. I was really, really sad to learn that Carlos had to go through what he went through. I mean, having appendicitis, and then he actually did, some practice with that particular, ailment, was really admirable and of him, but probably not the wisest idea. So at some point that happened. But look, we've been talking a lot about Kimi Antonelli, but I think after this race, we should talk about Ollie Bearman. I mean, he did a
Well,
fantastic job.
he was on pole for F2, wasn't he, before he got the
He was
call
on
up?
pole for
So
F2,
in
so
a Prema that is not doing very well at the moment.
exactly.
So
So
yeah,
I mean,
impressive.
look, we should add him to the list of to the short list of Mercedes candidates for 25. I don't know, maybe that
I
doesn't
think
happen, but you know what I mean.
Ferrari might have something to say about that.
Ferrari might have something to say about that, but I mean, what a fan! I mean, for me, the race was really, it just sort of came down to that. That was my big shining sort of takeaway from this is he seems like a great prospect and a great talent, and really that Ferrari is really really good. I mean, outside of Red Bull, it is really good. So that was my number one thing there. What did you take away as your biggest thing?
So there are a couple. I look. I like seeing battles that are technical, and
Mm,
you can see how one driver is sort of trying to keep another driver behind, and how another driver is trying
yeah,
to attack. And I thought
yeah,
the Piastri Hamilton battle was very
it's
interesting. It was
amazing.
always a bit, yeah, it was a bit of a flawed battle because we always knew that Lewis was going to have to pit at some point to come in for those hard tires, but actually it was really interesting because you were able to see the relative strengths and weaknesses of both cars, and it was flipped again on its head when both Lewis and Lando came in for
Nice,
their
yeah,
pit
yeah,
stops. Um, Lewis can consider himself a little bit unlucky in that he made some headway with the undercut, and Lando obviously had a slow pit stop, so he should have come out ahead, but he came out behind, and it gave us the flip side of the Oscar Piastri Lewis Hamilton battle. So we know where those very quickly, but clearly the McLaren has kept some of its strengths from last year. So in the medium and high speed corners, it's really stable, really biddable, and they can really lean on it. It's got good downforce in those situations. It's not quite so good in the low speed corners, which is why it seemed to have struggled quite badly in Bahrain. But here, the track sort of played to its strength. Both cars probably could have done a little bit better in qualifying. I think Alonso outperformed his car, and I think both Lando and Oscar should have been a bit further forward if it hadn't been for that. But in the race, Oscar was obviously really quick in sector 1, which is the sort of as soon as you come out of the 2 chicanes, they're potentially full throttle corners if you've got decent downforce, but they're not if you don't, and the rear starts to go awry a little bit. So they had to the McLaren had really good stability there, whereas Lewis, particularly in his Mercedes, did not. So Oscar was catching, and then in sector 2 and sector 3, where there were longer straights, Lewis was able to create a little bit of a gap, and down the back straight, where you'd expect that with a bit of DRS, Oscar should have been able to get past. He just didn't have the differential. I think Bernie Collins said in comms that it was only a 6 km/h difference in speed with the DRS open, whereas it was something like 16 km/h when Charles Leclerc went past. So Lewis was able to use that against Oscar for lap after lap after lap until they finally came in, and then it was all flip reverse, because behind Lando for the first few laps, Lewis had DRS going up the pit straight, but was always too far back to get it because he'd lost so much. I mean, the amount of time he was losing in sector 1, it was visible to the naked eye. Literally within a corner or two, you could see how far ahead Lando was getting. And ultimately, that was what cost Lewis a position further forward. But again, this is going to come, like, as fun as that was, George Russell finished 6th, and Lewis finished 9th, 3 places behind. And ultimately, for me, that's a function of the fact that Lewis just didn't qualify high enough. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit in a different segment, but that's a big problem that I have about Lewis's performance over the weekend. What did you think of Fernando?
I thought Fernando had a brilliant race once again, right? I mean, you for him to put that Aston up there, right, smack dead in the middle of maybe even I mean, going into the race, you could have thought a podium finish was a possibility. Clearly, they're not there with Ferrari and of course with the Red Bulls, but he drove. I mean, as does Fernando. He does this, right? Like, it's if there's one driver that I think all of us can root for to have a victory, right, regardless of our own sort of personal favorites, it's him. And I thought he did a brilliant job throughout the race. I think it was well managed. He was smart. I mean, you go back to we didn't talk about qualifying, right? But we saw what he did there in his trying to put his last lap in Q3, or just taking that toe from Lewis and then sort of going straight, and so awesome, so cool. I don't understand why other drivers aren't that way. Like, it just makes you feel like Fernando is one of one. We know that, but it was just amazing. I think he drove a good race. I think that's the most they could have done. It's a bit of a shame to have seen his teammate go into the wall, because that car looked like it could have been in the mix. I mean, I think the 3 Mercedes engines, right, are teams rather, are right there in the mix with each other. But I mean, to sort of piggyback on your McLaren and sort of Mercedes battle, right? It just goes to show you how flawed these cars are, right? Like how they're. I mean, you couldn't see, as you said, a better representation of it. That the race gave you all of that, right? And I wish I could have seen the Aston Martin in the mix with all of this. Like, it would have been nice to kind of see where they're at, because you just sort of lost. So it was a bit of a lonely race, but he did a good job. He managed the pace, as Fernando always does. He says things on the radio that
they're brilliant. The pits. I mean, I'm pretty sure he managed to get himself he
He
managed
managed
to
to get
get Sergio Perez a penalty.
he did that. He did
Oh,
that. He
that
hit
was
those brakes
close.
extra hard there, right? Just to make sure
Exactly.
there's a little bit of rubber burning, and it really just wanted to. And it's really smart, really smart.
So just a couple of quick points of contention. The first one was the jump start, Lando Norris's jump start. So just to be clear, Lando clearly went before the lights went out. George Russell called it very quickly, but he had a very good view of it, sitting next to him on the grid as he did. But that was dismissed later on in the race, and no further action required. And when the steward report came out, despite the fact that we could see quite clearly that the car had jumped the start, the FIA's response to this was that the visual confirmation is not what they base their decision on, it's the transponder. So if the transponder triggers and says that the car has jumped the start, they will give a penalty. If it does not trigger, no matter what it looks like, they will not give it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. That my initial feeling was that this would be a penalty coming his way, but clearly the technology they put in place did the job. And I even looked at the sort of the post race analysis, and it seemed like he was okay. So he just sort of, I don't know. I mean, to me it felt like it was okay, but it seemed like the stewards had a lot more angles to everything and a lot more data. So. That's one of those penalties that it is either a penalty or it's not a penalty, right? I don't know. Is it a subjective thing? It shouldn't be, right? Like you either you either cross the line or you didn't cross the line. Like that's it. But I think that the moving penalty which was brought up, right? Which I think Sebastian Vettel had a similar um instance. Was it 2017 or 20?
Yeah,
I
I
can't
think
remember.
maybe it was 2019, but
It was
I don't know what you're
2019.
talking
He
about.
had
Yeah.
something similar, and he even didn't get penalized because I think he still managed to stay within the. And I think ultimately, like if you're not going right, I mean that start wasn't good for Lando anyway. So I mean, what's the point in penalizing
Yeah,
them? It
I mean
doesn't seem like.
it's definitely not China 2012
Yes, that's of
or
course,
whatever that
of
Alonso did. You
course.
remember that one where he just
Yes,
jumped the
I
start,
do.
just kept on going?
If you're gonna do it, then just keep going. Like
Just
forget
keep
it.
going.
Why
No,
even
just
matter?
commit. Just commit all
Well, I
in.
mean, yeah, I think it was fine. Um, all of that did bring up interestingly how penalties were doled out, right? Because I didn't realize that there were now 10-second penalties. Like it was
Because they'd
probably
asked
mentioned.
for
I
them
didn't know.
though.
Yeah.
I mean, mate, Kevin Magnussen was a menace in that race. His was it on Albon? I mean, his
On
move on Albon was just come
It's
on.
crazy.
Like
Yeah, he
there's
was just
zero space, and you're gonna push him in the
well.
wall.
I love what Haas
Had to
did though,
had to get
right?
a
As a
penalty.
team, like they pretty much put him. They said, "You
Oh,
go ahead.
mate, the
We're
road
gonna fight for that one."
they truly trained everyone. That was very, very clever. Um,
So I would love to just cut up the Magnussen portion of the race and show it to people who think F1's not interesting, right? Because here you have three teams, right? Because it was Haas, it was VCarb, and it was Williams. They're battling it out for effectively 1 point. And oh, by the way, that 1 point only became available because Stroll went into the wall. Otherwise, that point wasn't
it's true.
even going to be available. And then look at how they fought it. Look at that. That's
It was very
excellent.
charitable. It was
It
very
was.
charitable on Magnussen's part, I thought. Okay. Just okay. So the last thing on in this segment, there was a one little bit of validation I wanted to bring to our attention, right?
Hmm.
So we made a video about the Mercedes-Benz front
Yes.
wing and how it's going to cause a problem with following, right? And we got a massive backlash. I really had to
A lot of
question
love.
my I had to question my own sanity after that video. But there was a little moment when Piastri was following
Yeah, I can
Lewis,
see.
went round the outside, got up alongside just behind his front wing, and then had to lock up and went wide at the at turn one. And Karun, in his ultimate wisdom, called it in comms the same way I was thinking, was that that seems a bit dodgy, doesn't it? That seems like the outwash has affected Oscar Piastri's car. So there you go. I think that front wing is starting to cause a problem for the car following, and it has, in this instance at least, prevented an overtake.
It did. And when Karun said that, I was like, we said that first. We said that. We said that. We
It's
got a lot of
We did say that first.
We got a lot of hate for it, but I mean, look, I think if Mercedes were competitive in the sense that they were actually fighting for
Yeah,
podiums, I think this would
exactly.
be a different conversation.
Yeah,
But I think
yeah, yeah.
that I'm a little bit surprised Zach Brown hasn't decided to make a bigger deal out of it. But
He can't. The problem is this is one of those things you have to lobby the FIA and say, oh look, they're ruining the racing. And
and
then the FIA would have to be like, you're
maybe
right.
maybe a good thing. I do have one thing I want to bring up to you, right?
Mm.
Which is again, it's also related to the Red Bull video we did, right? But I think now with two races in the books, right? It is fair to say that Red Bull is running away with it. Like it doesn't feel like because, and I mean, Max is Max, fine. We already knew that. But good God, Checo's done a great job. He has done a brilliant job. And even the 5 second penalty he got, it was not his fault, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, what did he put on Charles? I mean, I think with the penalty, it was like
5 seconds in the end, wasn't it?
5 seconds. Yeah. So without the penalty, it would have been almost 10 seconds, right? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's
Well, I think the look, my sort of ray of optimism for this is that with their mechanical platform sorted out, ostensibly anyway, and I think even Mercedes with their bouncing ultimately have a better mechanical platform. The downforce gains that they will get as the season progresses will be much more tangible. It's not like they're going to stick downforce on it, it's suddenly going to push the car down, and then they're going to have no travel. They're going to be too low to the ground. They're going to be porpoising again. You'd hope that having sorted that side of things out, that won't happen now. So you'd expect that upgrades over the course of the season will bring them closer to Red Bull. Now, obviously, Red Bull will bring their own upgrades as well, but I still think they have a lower ceiling than everybody else. So you'd hope that as the season progresses, the other teams will get closer. But let's see.